Okay, we are recording.
Okay, hi everyone. So I'm here today to talk about climate grief. But before I get into it, I'm just gonna say that we are in Amiskwacis, Waskahegan on traditional Cree, Blackfoot, Dene, Nakota Sioux, Saulteaux, and Métis Nation territory. And I personally live in Park Allen, which is on unceded Papas Chase Cree territory. And as a white settler, I benefit from the ongoing oppression of Indigenous peoples. And I invite all of us to consider the meaning of the land where we live and commit to living in right relations with the original inhabitants of the land. And this is especially, I think, interesting and important to think about as we consider how Shmitah fits into our relationship with the land. So the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to try and do a short introduction to the concept of climate grief, but then I really want to open it up to facilitate more discussion about how it relates to faith communities and to what we've been talking about in this class. Talking about grief can be difficult. It's okay if you need to leave at any time or just turn off your video for a bit. We're all at different points in the process of grief, but I hope this can be a safe space for expressing emotions. And just a note that this presentation is adapted from a presentation designed by my friend Gabrielle Gelderman, who's doing a master's studying Christian theology and climate grief. So I've gotten a lot of the information that I'm going to share with you comes from her. Did that work? Wow, technology. So I'm sure we're all aware of climate change. This animation is showing the shrinking Arctic sea ice over time since 1984. Although for many of us, climate change might be lower on our list of worries than it was, for example, this time last year before the pandemic. And some of the emotions we feel related to the pandemic may also be tied up with our feelings of climate grief. For example, social and economic inequalities that are rooted in our extractive economy are exacerbated by climate change, and they're also exacerbated by the pandemic. We might also be thinking about how increased sanitation has increased demand for single-use plastics, or how safer modes of transportation like private vehicles contribute more emissions and are less accessible for lower income folks than public transit. All right, I'm just going to introduce myself real quick. My name is Amelia. I use they, them pronouns. I was invited to speak to you by Ilara, who I know from Westwood Unitarian Congregation. And I first heard about the concept of climate grief through my friend Gabrielle, who I mentioned, and who I met when we were both organizing with Climate Justice Edmonton. So I'm a biologist. Both my parents are biologists, so I grew up knowing that the natural world was being damaged by human activities. I study lichens, that's what's in the photo there, which are often considered to be indicator species, the first species to be damaged when an area is affected by pollution. So I encounter the effects of ecological crisis often in work. I've been involved in climate organizing a bit over the past 2 years, and for me this was an outlet for some of the climate grief that I had been feeling. So let's get into it. You may be wondering at this point, what is climate grief? I'm just wondering, by a show of hands, who has heard the term before? Okay, most of us. And maybe what things come to mind when you hear the phrase?
The 5 stages of grieving. I think many of us are at the stage of anger of like, how the fuck did we get to this point?
I think about the fact that I go through it and then I go to sleep again and then I experience it again and then I go to sleep again, because it's just it's so hard to stare at continuously. I have to look away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so this definition that I have here is climate grief is the natural human response, conscious or subconscious, to the losses we experience and anticipate as a result of the climate crisis. So, as we mentioned, it captures a range of emotions and responses to loss. These can include so many things from anxiety or despair to gratitude and even joy sometimes. And grieving is an active process. Grief work is the process of seeking healing and meaning through the act of mourning. So these are some different aspects of climate grief. For one thing, it's disenfranchised grief, which means that it's not necessarily culturally recognized as such, as opposed to things like death, were like very much expected socially to grieve at. It's ambiguous grief, which means that it doesn't have an acute onset. For some of us, it may have been kind of present in the background throughout our whole lives. And it's anticipatory, which means that it's grief over anticipated future loss as opposed to something that has already been lost. So these are the 5 stages of grief. You may have encountered these maybe in pop culture or in other situations. This is by no means the only model of how grief works, but it can be useful in thinking about climate grief. One important thing to note about this, though, is that the stages don't necessarily occur in order. You can always be bouncing back and forth between different ones depending on how things are going on a particular day. So, yeah, which one do you think that this picture connects with?
Anger.
Probably anger or bargaining. More anger than bargaining.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Anger. Yeah, so at this point, maybe take a moment to think about if you've experienced one of these 5 stages, or maybe if you've witnessed them in others. Try to maybe think about a specific memory, how you felt in that moment, and what might have triggered those feelings. And if you're comfortable, we can take a minute to share some of these experiences before we move on.
So I'm passionate about endangered species conservation. So I think I've been in anger like since I was 9.5, 10 years old when I found out giant pandas were endangered. And then it has just gotten worse over the last 21 years? Yeah, 21 years. So I think I've been in anger for a while. And I might bounce a little bit into like bargaining of like, okay, well, if we do X, Y, and Z, then we'll mitigate the problems that we have. And then I go back to anger of like, you guys are all morons or schmucks and not realizing how bad this is and how much we have to do in order to keep our planet from completely collapsing on us. That's at least where I'm at. I haven't gone, I might bounce a little bit in a couple of places whenever I hear like a species has gone extinct in the wild into depression. Like, really? We've just lost another species?
Yeah.
I'm thinking now that you brought these stages of grief, and I've been wondering, so the kind, yeah, like my whole exploration of Shmitah, I don't know if it's post acceptance or if it's still bargaining.
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to tell, hey?
Yeah. Like, will it make any difference? I honestly, maybe that's the depression part.
I remember going through this acutely around 2006, 2007. And it was wrapped up with the economic crash that happened at that time for me. And I was reading a lot of stuff written by so-called doomers, and I was definitely in that camp myself, like envisioning society falling apart very, very quickly. And part of it was about climate change. And I remember feeling very isolated, like, am I going crazy? I'm seeing all of this horrible stuff happening or about to happen and not seeing my concerns mirrored in the society around me. But since then, I'd say I kind of bounce back and forth between denial, not in the sense of actually denying, but in the sense of just sort of looking away, like I said, letting myself get preoccupied with other things and forgetting about it. And then something reminds me and I go back into depression, and then I move through that into acceptance. And then I'm back to some form of denial as I let other things distract me.
Mm-hmm.
But I just saw a documentary about Greta Thunberg, and one of the memorable lines is, she says, "My name's Greta Thunberg, and I want you to panic." And
Mm-hmm.
I don't seem to have the fortitude that she has to just remain focused on this problem all the time and never look away from it.
Yeah, I definitely bounce between all the stages. And the moment I think that really stands out for me was actually when Greta was here in Edmonton. And at first I was like really excited because it was a really big event and there was like a lot of energy around it. But then I was like so enraged for days at the media's response and at our government's response. And like, yeah, I was so enraged, and at people's response to the news articles too, just like the amount of denial that was being presented, and just like so much negative energy towards somebody trying so hard to do a good, like a young person trying so hard to do a good thing. Yeah, that's like a real moment that stands out with climate grief, because I just like, I had that moment of hope, and then it was just so strongly dashed by the response of the masses.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for sharing your experiences. Was there anyone else who wanted to say anything before I move on with the rest of my talk?
We can't actually hear you, Sharon. I mentioned in the chat, I don't know why your mic's not working, but we'd still love to hear from you, obviously. Maybe you could type in the chat what you wanted to say.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. Okay, I'm gonna finish or move into the next part of the presentation. We'll have some more time for discussion afterwards as well, hopefully. I'm just gonna like walk through all the stages, but it sounds like you all have a pretty good handle on what they mean. But the first one is denial and avoidance, which may involve feelings of numbness or shock. And it actually is a healthy part of the grieving process. It allows us to ease into it and to not be hit all at once, which Robert, you kind of mentioned this, like it can be very mentally and emotionally taxing to be very involved in this all the time, and sometimes we do need to take a break. So yeah, an example would be sometimes taking a break from reading the news, or not reading the news, like the only reading in the morning, not right before you go to bed or something, to just like kind of avoid those stress levels, which is something that I do. The next one is anger. I definitely feel this one a lot. Anger, for example, directed at those in power for not doing more about the climate crisis, at corporations for acting irresponsibly, all these kinds of things, or even anger at other people who we don't believe are kind of on the same page as us in terms of thinking that crisis is as bad as it is. The third one is bargaining. This is sort of when you think, oh, if only I had done this, if only we had made this decision instead of that one, then maybe it kind of comes out of feelings of helplessness, and it's often can be accompanied by feelings of guilt as well. And then this is number 4. Yeah, the fourth one is depression. There's a difference between despair and depression, although sometimes it's kind of hard to tell. This is also one that I find myself in, and it can get overwhelming, especially given the pandemic combined with everything else. It can be more persistent when we feel alone in our grief, and I find that sharing and expressing climate grief in community can be helpful. And this is also, I think, where faith communities kind of can have a role to play, which is sort of a unique positioning that not a lot of other like community groups are really equipped to deal with these kinds of feelings. And then the fifth one is acceptance. We might ask ourselves if this is something you can ever accept. Like Rabbi was sort of talking about how you weren't sure if you were feeling acceptance or were in, I think you said bargaining. Yeah, there's a criticism in the climate movement that climate grief work is fatalistic, and that trying to accept the new normal prevents people from taking action. Maybe that it's privileged to be able to really sit in our feelings instead of taking concrete action. I'm not sure if this is entirely true, but it's something to think about. And we can, there's Greta, we can think about balancing grief and action. Like, for example, how can we grieve when so many others around the world are experiencing these devastating direct climate impacts? But on the other hand, it is like, it's not really sustainable to, it's hard to keep up direct work if you're not kind of dealing with these strong emotions that can come up during this. So I think there really is value in like working through these feelings related to grief. So I found this quote, and I was wondering if someone wanted to read it out loud as we close out.
Grief expressed out loud, whether in or out of character, choreographed, and honest, for someone we have lost, or a country or home we've lost, is in itself the greatest praise we could ever give them. Grief is praise because it is the natural way love honors what it misses.
Thank you. I really love this. For me, this quote helps me think about climate grief as love for the land. And based on what I've learned in the few Shmitah classes that I've attended here, I kind of interpret that giving the land a rest every 7 years is an act of respect and love for the land. So I think that's kind of a neat connection we could draw here. But I would also love to hear your thoughts on what I've talked about today. So I'm going to ask, what can communities of faith do to help us move through climate grief and into action? And more specifically, how is Shmitah related to climate grief? And just any other thoughts you might have. I'd like to open it up for discussion here.
Well, in terms of like moving towards action on climate change and everything that's going on, communities of faith can be a organizational point, especially for somebody who's on their own pretty much and is trying to figure out how to take action and have enough of a voice as to like why we need to do, how to not necessarily fix it, but to start mitigating some of the effects humans have had on our planet, especially with the more industrialized nations. So to me, faith communities can be more of a rallying point and a place to start. We're starting to have an impact because there's stuff that one person can do, but it's only going to help so much.
Speaking from personal experience, that point where I was going through climate grief for the first time was also, well, shortly thereafter, I discovered the Quakers. I'm a Quaker as well as Jewish. And I was in sabbatical in England at the time. And that was a real lifesaver for me, an absolute lifesaver, because there was a critical mass within the Quaker movement that really got climate change. They understood. They were going through grief as well, and so it became a safe place for me to share the grief that I was going through, and that was absolutely crucial to my sanity. It's probably the reason that I didn't commit suicide.
I found that same sort of thing with Westwood Unitarian, personally.
I want to read what Raul wrote here in the chat, just so we all have it. And Robert, I'm glad you didn't commit suicide. Mamash. I'm glad you found that place that was a safe place. So Raul writes here, I think that we as consumers in religious communities, we should buy products that do not harm the environment. And maybe also the communities themselves as a group should think about how we act as a community. And as you were talking, I was thinking of the idea of grief and the place of grief. And I was thinking of religious practices surrounding it. And what came to my mind was not grief, but was the act of mourning. Like the act, not just the process, but the actual mourning rituals that could be done either in private or better still as a community, to not just to express grief, but to work through grief and back into a place of doing, like being in the world. So like mourning rituals that actually help us as a group mourn the loss of something or someone, and then be able to live again. And in this case, go back into action, I think. So not getting stuck in grief through that. So I think many religious traditions and spiritual traditions have developed strong tools of mourning. And that's something it would be interesting to look at again.
Yeah. So that would be turning it from disenfranchised grief into a form of grief that's more socially accepted and is incorporated with these rituals. I really like that.
Yeah.
And it's beyond being socially accepted. It allows it also to, it allows us to, because sometimes grief can numb us and take us out of the world, like take us into death. And I think active mourning brings us back into the world and into life. And you were talking before, you kind of, you started opening up this idea, which I think is really interesting to look at some point, of being so entrenched in grief that we don't do anymore. We're just in grief, kind of lost hope. And I think if there's something many religious traditions teach us, is there's always hope, which means we always need to do something.
Yeah. Speaking of hope, I don't remember who it was, but I heard a talk at a General Assembly a few years ago about hope, and the definition given was actually in the context of climate grief, and it was basically acknowledging the unknown of the future and the unknown of our own actions, and having like and acting in a positive way anyway. Like that was kind of like the definition of hope, was like acting toward what we want to see, but at the same time holding that we don't know what will happen. And I think that can be a hard place to come to with climate grief, because it's really, we have so many projections and so many of them are so catastrophic, right? But we don't know. And it's really hard to sit with the unknowing. It's almost easier just to give up and think, oh, it's all going to hell in a handbasket anyway, right? Like it's easier to give up than to hold that place of, well, maybe my actions will make a difference, but we don't know what that difference will be. So I feel like that's kind of a unique thing that religious communities have, is like, I got that piece of information really inspired me, and I got that from one of the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly talks. So like I think one of the things that we have as religious communities that is essential is that we're in the business of making meaning, and I think that we have to have meaning in our lives in order to be in a place psychically that we can take positive action. And I really love that idea of active mourning. I think that would be a really big piece of that. But yeah, offering some depth of meaning so that we're in the places inside ourselves that we can act in a hopeful manner.
In Extinction Rebellion, we use this slogan, and I think it comes from Catherine Hayhoe, that now is not the time for hope, now is the time for courage. And we also talk about this drug hopium that people keep wanting to get fixes of, and it can actually be dysfunctional in a situation like this to try to cling to a hope that will be disappointed.
That's fair, but I'm going off of the definition of hope as being able to hold the unknown. So it's not about holding a positive future and thinking we'll get there. It's about not knowing and acting towards a positive future anyway. So yeah, I definitely think hopium is a thing when it's like clinging to the possibility of a positive future and not worrying because it'll all work out. Like, yeah, that's dangerous. But if you have that ability to hold the ambiguity, I think there's a bit of a difference there.
Which in itself is a religious place to be in, to be able to hold the unknown. Because I think part of the problem of the society that we live in, and I think Shmitah really ties into it in the sense that Shmitah teaches us once every 7 years to let go and hold on to the unknown and be in the unknown. So in a sense, and that's a religious practice that, many religious practices work on that. And one of the problems, I think, of our society is that we don't know how to do that. We think we can control. This is a big practice in letting go. And now we can't control it anymore.
Yeah, and it's that need for knowing that always leads us to so many extreme polarities too.
Mm-hmm. So
We as a human species do not like the unknown. That's why climate crisis is such a huge problem, is we've allowed ourselves to make plans for so long and not consider the consequences for the future for so long that now we're coming up against the wall. And now we're basically at the point of we don't know what happens if we don't do anything. We have plenty of dystopian science fiction that tells us it's going to be bad. But not enough people read dystopian science fiction to understand how bad it could get, which is part of the problem in my mind.
I need to look for, there's articles and also podcasts that deal with this question of dystopian versus utopian, or rather dystopian versus, why do we, because I'm not sure I agree with you. I think our whole culture is steeped in dystopian futures and is very much into a narrative of apocalypse. And I've spoken with Robert about this many a time. And I still need to develop this thought, but I'm asking myself, and it's not just me. So there's other people who are worried about and trying to figure out how to deal with this climate crisis, that we're not sure if dystopian novels is what we need more of, rather maybe not utopian novels, but things that can project us into a different future. So like the thing I always have, again, which is why I keep going back to this question of Shmitah, but my partner, Ariel, he's very much into cars. Like his passion is cars. Now it's electric cars, but cars in general. And he always says that when you're driving, you can't look just outside of you have to look way down to the edge of, like, the farthest you can look towards, so that you can drive really fast and really well. I never tried that. I don't. But when you're a race driver, okay? So, and I think that's something we need to, like, if we put at the edge of our vision only dystopia, we're gonna drive towards dystopia. It seems to me. It doesn't mean that if we put something else at the edge, we might not arrive at some terrible future, but where are we aiming at? I think that's the question, for me at least. And, and that's not to say that dystopia novels and sci-fi aren't valuable, but what else can we add into the mixture? That's just my question. And where are we aiming at? And at least for me, this, you know, this exploration of Shmitah is a way for me to try and create a different kind of novel for ourselves. I don't know if it'll happen.
That makes me think of what you mentioned a while back, Rabbi, about practicing prophecy. And I think I wrote in a book that's not really dystopian, not really utopian, but I think it's really super prophetic, that I read recently. And the idea of visionary fiction is something that's been on my radar a lot lately, within a few different circles, Westwood included. Actually, we've been talking about it quite a bit. But I think it's important for us to choose our narratives. And in some of my courses that I've taken, we talked about how the human brain is wired for beginnings and endings. So we're always narrating apocalypse. Like for thousands of years, we've been narrating apocalypses, right? It's not a new story. The apocalypse is not a new story. We've been talking about the end of the world since we began. So like, I think it's important to be conscientious of that and like aware that yes, while we're in a very dire situation, like how much of it is reality and how much of it is narrative, and how much of shifting the narrative will change the reality and vice versa. Like there's a really interesting interplay there, I think. Not to say that shifting the narrative will necessarily change the world, like I'm not that naive, but I think that like those intellectual shifts can, like they have a play in things, I think. So but yeah, I would recommend that book. It's really good.
Is it the book that you put here in the chat? Parable of...
I've actually heard of this and this
Really
particular
good.
book, and it's much on my list to read because of how prophetic it is.
So prophetic, it blows my
And so,
mind.
like, because it's set in 2020s.
It was written in 1993 and it's set in 2024, and it is mind-boggling. It feels like she was writing newspaper headlines from now. It's just ridiculous. Yeah.
I've heard of like how prophetic this book is, even though it's barely 25 years old.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Does it have a happy ending?
What was my question?
It has an ambiguous ending.
It
It doesn't have a sad ending, and it doesn't have there's a sequel. I haven't read it yet.
So just piggybacking on what a number of us have said, it strikes me that one of the real challenges that the climate justice movement faces, that it hasn't been able to surmount up to now, is to articulate an attractive, feasible sounding direction that captures people's imaginations. I think most people, when they hear climate change, they think, well, the only possible response is either we just keep going the way we're going and whatever happens, or we have to subject ourselves to a real severe deprivation. Like we have to accept that our children might starve to death and we won't have jobs and all that kind of stuff. And it's too gruesome for people to let themselves even go there. There's been no ability to articulate, if we move away from a capitalist, industrialist, fossil fuel-based economy, what would the new economy look like? you know, and how would we find meaning in our lives, and what things would remain the same, and what things would be different, and what things might be considerably better. And yeah, I wish I could write the book or the movie or whatever that could articulate that vision, that people would see it and want it. But that's a crucial piece that's missing.
There are attempts being made with visionary fiction. That's why I brought it up. I would say Parable of the Sower fits into that category.
Mm-hmm.
But there are attempts being made to rewrite the narratives, and I think there's a lot of beauty in them. There's also, yeah, my pleasure, Raul. There's also, oh,
Could you create a list for us, a reading list, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got, because emergent strategy is all based on, the book I brought up last time is all based on and written around Parable of the Sower. It's like a lot of observation brought forth from Parable of the Sower, and they both are like, emergent strategy is more practical, like it's more about organizing and how to be together, based off of Parable of the Sower, but Parable of the Sower is very much visionary fiction. But yes, I will. Brood, Octavia's Brood, that's what it's called. There's like a website. I'll find it and put it on the website.
All right, I gotta read these books. I've got a stack of books that I've already got to read, but this sounds obligatory.
Yeah, and Octavia's Brood is actually a website of collective visionary fiction from all over the world. There's a book that Adrienne Marie Brown, who's the author of Emergent Strategy, helped to edit into being, but then there's also a website that's just, there's so much there, and you can add to it. It's like a collective writing project.
Thank you, Ilara.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I'll write both of those things on the website.
Yeah.
Too, as well as in the chat.
That would be amazing. Yeah. So we need to start wrapping up, but Amelia, would you like to kind of close at least your thoughts on this?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I have anything good to conclude with, but I think I've learned more in the last 20 minutes than the information I gave you, but that's good. I'm really glad that we were able to have this discussion. Would definitely recommend the budget strategy. If anyone is looking for more reading on climate grief in particular, I could recommend some links.
Why don't you send them my way, and I can put them in a post on the website Rabbi Gila put together. I'll just make a big collective post of links from you and
yeah, that would be great.
Links.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Joanne Macy is one person.
Okay, so first of all, I wanted to say thank you very much for bringing this, Amelia. I think it's extremely important to look at it and to acknowledge it and to remind ourselves and to allow ourselves to say this. We're trying to be very positive here all the time, but I think at the back of all of our minds is this, and I'm sure we're all dealing with it. So thank you for bringing it and for allowing this discussion to develop. And I think we have arrived at some really interesting places today, and I'm looking forward to reading the books. Ilara, if you'll notice, when I created the blog area, the forum area, there's one area that's specific for the Shmitah project. So if you want to post there, so then we'll have all of our information for the Shmitah.
Okay, cool.
And at least I wanted to end my thoughts for today. But that's coming out of the Jewish tradition. And I think one way that Judaism has always dealt with these questions of how do we continue even throughout loss and grief is through mamash action. Like, I think halakha religious law, however way we build it in our days. But halakha in itself is a way of taking what we want to see in the world and making it a reality. Like that's what halakha does. That's the tool of halakha. And not just that, but also to allowing ourselves not to be the center of our world, but rather something else is the center. I heard today a rabbi I'm learning with saying that God is a placeholder, like the word God is a placeholder for the other, whoever that other is. So it's not me, I'm not in the center, something else is in the center, somebody else, something else. So, and I think articulating a halakha around Shmitah, at least for me, could enable me to imagine what a viable, healthy future might look like. So that goes down to practice. But thank you very much. Please add all your thoughts into the forum, and thank you for sharing things there already. It's really interesting to see what people have put there. So I encourage you to go and look and kind of continue our conversation outside here. But thank you so much, Amelia, for bringing this.
Thanks for having me here.